Hello and welcome all. I know in previous weeks we have been discussing landscape maintenance. Today we're going to go over that a little bit more. However, before we get started, I do have a question for all of you. I know at the beginning when y'all were walking in, I handed each of you a sticky note, and on that sticky note I want you to answer this question. What pruning procedures are used to maintain landscape plants? Now, I know we haven't really discussed it much, but I know all of you have taken a previous horticultural class, so there must be some knowledge there. And even if there isn't, we're going to go over that today. And so I pulled the timer over here. You'll have a minute to write down your answer with your name, and so you may begin.
What are we doing?
When you're done with the sticky note, you can go ahead and gum up and stick it on the paper. At the end of the lesson, we'll go back over it and talk about it. But make sure your name is on it. Five seconds. But if you ain't done, we could always, wait. So is anybody still working on that? So from what I've seen walking around, you all had some pretty good ideas or thinking of some good ideas, but we'll get to that later at the end. But first, I know yesterday I sent out on the Google Classroom some notes to go over, and so we're just going to quickly go through them a little bit, and hopefully it answers the question over there. And so, like I said, today's topic will be pruning. And the thing with pruning is you always have to decide when is the right time, especially starting off with winter. Because winter, it freezes. One day it might be warm here in North Carolina, and the next day it might be 40 degrees. So you want to make sure you prune with enough time before it gets cold so that the wounds have enough time to kind of heal a little bit, because you have to keep in mind the plant's dormant. You don't want to ruin it during the winter months, so when spring wraps around and comes back, you want to make sure the plant is the best it can be. Speaking of spring, that's next on our list. You have to make sure, especially during spring, there's new growth, new opportunity. Plants, especially with the azaleas that you each see on your tables, the branches are kind of mismatched and tangled. You want to make sure to go in there and where the new leaves that are growing, the branches that are tangled, those become undone. Take the new leaves and kind of hide where you've pruned and trimmed, so your plant will look pretty good and not like you took a hack job to it. I know in summertime, which would be next, that's when you have to make sure, before it hits winter, you have to prepare for your plants. It's getting really hot, so during that time, you would go in and you would prune things, but here's the kicker. During summertime, many of the shrubs, like your ligustrums and your boxwoods, that's when they're in full bloom. So, especially with your boxwoods, as you can see in the picture over here, they're kind of a mess, I'm not gonna lie. And so you would go in and make sure it's the appropriate height. It doesn't look like you took a weed whacker to it. You would want to shake them up a little bit, but make sure it's as earlier on in the summer, because the longer you wait, the closer you get to winter. And you don't want to go in and prune your bushes before winter, and then winter hits the next day and it freezes and it's cold, your shrubs probably wouldn't like that. And then in the fall, which kind of goes along with the whole winter aspect I was talking about, you don't want to wait too late in the fall because it will be getting colder. The wounds wouldn't have the appropriate time to heal, and then you fall into the issue of new growth when the cycle restarts. So, as we know, there's 3 different types of pruning. Thinning and heading back is, I don't want to say it's the same thing because they all have their differences, but thinning and heading back is just shortening the lengths of the branches, you're untangling the branches, you're basically making it look nice. But with rejuvenation, as you'll see on this slide, you're basically going in and cutting back certain parts of the bush completely so that when the next year or the next growing season comes, it'll grow much bigger and better. And so during that time, you go in and take a different portion of the bush that's kind of growing out or kind of tangling up, and you would trim that all the way back to the base. Is there any questions so far? So for tools, as you'll see up here, I have different types of tools. You have your hand pruners or hand shears, you have your head shears, and you have your loppers. And so, yes, Steve.
Can you use scissors to prune like really small limbs and branches?
That's a very good question, and as you see, I'll have scissors up here. However, it is not a normal tool you would use to trim your shrubs or your bushes because you would use something like a hand pruner. As a scissor would come in and kind of have your branches kind of jagged and stuff. You don't want that. You want a nice clean cut in order for your shrub to be the best it can be. Is there any other questions?
Do you have to have a license to buy pruning shears, or can you get them at your local hardware store?
Well, it's also another very good question, because you would think running a business, you have to have permits for this, you have to have permits for that. However, when it comes to your average hand pruners, you don't need a permit for it. You can go down to your local Home Depot or your Lowe's. It's right there on the shelf. You can grab it, and you can actually do your own pruning at the house. So, like I said, it's a very good question. Is there any other questions? And so, another thing we have to keep in mind when we are pruning, that if you cannot reach it from ground level, it's recommended that you use something like a power pole or a pole pruner, which I have a power pole over here. And it's essentially like I don't want to say it's like a chainsaw, but it's kind of like a motorized hand pruner. And so it can reach places where you essentially can't from the ground. And where the power pole pruner, you would use those for like the big limbs on the trees and stuff. And then the pole pruner you would use for the smaller branches you can't reach. And I wouldn't say some shrubs, because there are some shrubs that ain't really high, but basically like, you know how like on a branch, they have little small branches going out? You would use that on the smaller branches instead of the great big branch. Which leads us into our next thing. As you see on the tables around you, you each have a potted azalea. You three would team up with Jackson back there, you two would go with that one, and of course you two would go with that one. And using the knowledge that we have so far, and the guides that we have up here, basically, the easiest way to put this is, you're gonna do your own pruning. So kind of like a class project here. And if you have any questions, let me know. But you would go in and you assess what the azalea looks like, and using the notes that I have given you and this up here, you would go in and make it look pretty nice. And so, I don't fall over. You each will have 2 minutes to do it. Ready, set, go.
Ms. Holloman,
Yes.
which method of pruning would we be using for these azaleas?
So I would recommend, and I'll pull it up over here, so y'all see it. I would recommend thinning, because as you can clearly see with each azalea, the branches are kind of intertwined and twisted. And so you don't necessarily want to head back the complete thing, though there are a few branches you can possibly use as support. And you don't really want to go in and where it's flowering at for the next growing season, you don't want to go in and ruin that. So I would say it would be an even mixture of both.
So where would you recommend cutting on this plant?
So on this one, as so where all the rest of you can see, you see where the branches are kind of starting to intertwine?
Yeah.
You would go in to where the new leaf bud is and cut above that. And there's, in some instances, you want to cut below that, but you also don't want to have big old sticks like that. You're basically going in and trying not to ruin the new growth for the next season. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Is there any more questions so far? So do you understand?
You're at 11 and a half. You're at 11 and a half minutes.
Oh. Right in there. Don't want to take off like that. You also see how the branches are kind of intertwined in here. We'll take off that, please.
So, Ms. Holloman,
Yes.
would you recommend removing that large stem right there in the center, or should that be less and just kind of growing down?
So I would leave it there. I would trim it back a little bit. But as you see, it is growing, preparing for the new season. So I would completely remove it. And you don't want to completely damage the growth, but you want to take out enough that won't suffer there. Okay, time's up. Music. And so.
You're at 13.
Okay, so I would recommend all of you taking your azaleas and putting them on this table up here so we can kind of compare what we got so far. And this is the lesson that we're doing all week, and so kind of wrap things up here. I know on here, most of you said what we talked about, thinning and heading back, though there is one I have to ask. Jacob, you said cutting the dead growth. And so given the information we just learned, which procedure would you recommend cutting the dead growth with?
I'm not too sure on that.
Okay, so we go back to the PowerPoint real quick. And so for the dead growth, I would recommend heading back. Well, it's not gonna load, but you would want to go in and kind of cut the dead growth off. And depending on how bad it is, you would thin it. And so we'll go over this tomorrow to kind of tie up loose ends, but I want to thank you all for coming out and thank you.